Right, good evening and welcome to the discussion on Insight tonight. Now, just like we said, we're going to be talking about where we are as a country, the state of the nation as far as security and governance is concerned. And tonight we have a gentleman who introduced himself just before the break, and he talked to us about what his area of research and expertise and insight is. Karibu sana.
Thanks, Victor.
Right off the bat, you've seen the story that we aired before. You've seen what people have been talking about online and in the streets and in the different social spots. What's your assessment of where we are when it comes to matters security?
Yeah, so I think it's a very dicey situation, to be honest, because the challenge of dealing with the kind of situation we're in right now is that there has to be a balance between the requirement on the government to protect people and to protect property, while at the same time protecting people's rights to protest and to express themselves. And what we are seeing now is a scenario where the approach to the policing of the protest seems to not have changed. Even after the promulgation of the new constitution. And I think when the police are faced with such a formidable force against them, the chances that they revert back to the default are very high. And we are seeing this actually happening at the moment. I think the changes in the police leadership should have been an opportunity to invigorate the response and maybe for the police to actually reconsider their approach. What we saw instead is a scenario where they are trying to claw back on the protections that Kenyans have, in Article 37 of the Constitution, which obviously the courts have said, that's not going to fly. So they have to go back to the drawing board. And I think there are options about how this can be managed better. And so we hope, in the substantial, not just, the recruitment of the IG, but also in the thinking about how to shape this going forward. How do we bring, a balance between these Article 37 protections alongside ensuring that people's lives and, people's businesses and property are, also protected, right? And I think watching the Senate session, the first session after the protest of the 25th of June, one could see that there was a recognition by the government, because I remember Senator Aaron Cheruiyot really made a very strong case for this, that it's time for us now to actually think about what a protest is and how it should be policed, rather than obviously always assuming that protesters are, rioters or that they are criminals,
Right.
Yeah.
But now that we're on the subject, how do you police a protest? Picture our brothers and sisters in the police force looking in one direction and seeing a mob of people, 800 people, 1,000 people coming down the street this way, and another 1,000 people coming down the street the other way, and yet another 1,000 people behind them and 1,000 before them. Yeah. Talk to us about how do you, as a police officer, managing these riots, the protests, how do you actually police such? Right.
So I think the starting point is that just because people are on the street does not mean that they pose a security threat. So the idea that just because people are gathering that it's something for us to worry about, because one of the ways we could think about it actually as a parallel that we can think about here is we have seen massive political rallies in this country. They're policed events, right? So if we were to think about this as public assemblies in general, as a category, then it tells us that there are ways that this can actually be managed. The work of the police is to facilitate the activity, not to constrain it. I think what the challenge has been is that when you're, in government, you're a politician in the government and you're calling a massive rally, or when you're one of those untouchable ones, then the police exist there to actually just maintain law and order. It's a different kind of situation because there's a mass of people, as opposed to what they do on a day-to-day basis. But when we call the activity a protest, then there's this sense that it's something that needs to be policed in a slightly different way. So I think what we need to see from the police is that engagement with facilitating the movement and ensuring that maybe in some cases you see scenarios where there's counter protests, just keeping the two groups away from each other, for instance, being able to keep people from certain pathways which may not be safe for them, may even for the police. So there are ways that the police can actually do this, and we've seen it before because there have been many protests that we have witnessed in the country that have not turned violent. In fact, if we go back to just before the 25th of June, we saw several protests that were not marked by any violence. And it is interesting that in my study, when I was doing my PhD research, some of the things that people who've participated in the protests would tell me is, it was peaceful until the police arrived, right? So I think there's also that sense that while we often see the protesters or imagine the protesters as a source of insecurity, sometimes it is the police who are actually the source of the insecurity. Now, there are, approaches that have been tried elsewhere, and actually have been experimented in Kenya on one of those Saba March for Our Lives, organized by the Coalition of Social Justice Centers, where they worked with the police from a police station to agree on a route map for the protest and to actually have marshals coming from the social justice centers to kind of manage the way that the protest was being handled. And that went pretty well. However, the police are always nervous about protesters, right? So at some point, even that experiment did not work very well because at the end, the police, kind of disrupted it. But that means that even here locally, let alone what is happening abroad, we have tried some things that might actually give us a pathway on how we can address this.
Right. I want to clarify on a point you've made and perhaps give us a little bit more insight. And as we do that, please, my producer, could you be so kind as to put the WhatsApp number on the screen? I want the people to send in their questions. Now, could you talk to us about what happens in the mind of a police officer that makes them panic or makes them nervous? You did say that in a lot of those cases, it's when the police show up in force that things go south, as it were. Yeah. So what actually happens? What's that ingredient that creates chaos triggers that kind of, triggers the rungus to fly, so to speak? Well,
the thing we must remember is that ultimately, the police officer is a human being. And so while they're there under the guise of, protecting the nation, protecting property and so on, their first and foremost priority is to protect themselves and to protect their lives, right? I've seen police officers raise a lot of concerns about, flying objects. When people are throwing stones at police officers, the injuries can be quite significant. But of course, you cannot compare the impact of a stone to, the impact of a bullet.
Of a bullet, right?
Yeah. But that's one of the things. I think some of the things that I've seen in some research I have looked at, unfortunately, some of this is stuff that we as outsiders, as scholars, do not really get access to, but ex-police officers who have become researchers are able to access some information that we may not be able to get. And I remember being in a meeting where they were presenting some research, and one of the things was many of these police officers being sent out to the streets to police the protests are very young. So they may not have the experience of how to de-escalate a situation. And so they are nervous about, being in a major public assembly. I think legacy also matters a lot, right? All of us, even, you and I, if you're going to a protest, we will go into a protest a little bit nervous because of what we have seen happen in the country before. So it's not surprising that the police will most often come ready for the confrontation rather than for de-escalation. And of course, if you're coming for for conflict, then you can expect that there will be a response from the other side, right. Which kind of increases the risk and compounds that scenario. So there's sometimes in the protests we've seen in the past, less so what we are seeing now, is a scenario where there's almost a game that is being played between the protesters and the police, and the idea is that who can dominate the other quicker. Right? Of course, that creates a lot of anxiety, but the other thing is that you have two sides that are not equally equipped to deal with, with the situation. Someone came with a stone, the other one came with a gun. So, of course, that's likely to end up in a very disastrous kind of scenario.
Producer, please put the WhatsApp number on the screen. Now, one of the things that kind of, when you distill everything, you will stumble onto the stone of trust. Yeah. You did give an example where an organization that wanted to conduct some protests was able to go to the police, reach out, sit down, or conduct a shared briefing and decide on the route map and the terms of operations and the rules of engagement. Yeah. But then, of course, something did go wrong later. But really, the aspect of that kind of outreach, depends on trust. Yeah. And historically, trust is something that has been a little bit difficult to come by between the police and the citizenry, both ways, when it comes to dealing with crime. Yeah. Talk to us about where this comes from and how that can be fixed.
Wow, okay, that's a complex and difficult question, partly because we have to look way back to the history.
As briefly as you can.
Of the police, and you see from the very setup, during the colonial times, the work of the police was not to work with the citizens. The job of the police was to protect the regime. And what we have seen happen in all the regimes that have been in Kenya is that the police tend to prioritize the interest of the regime. So in fact, one of the reasons, to add to the previous questions, one of the reasons is that protests that are seen as challenging the regime of the day tend to be policed more brutally than other protests. We've seen protests that are pro-regime tend to not attract as much violence. So there's a fundamental orientation of the police towards protecting the regime. Now,
protecting the paymasters.
Exactly. Well, even though you could argue the paymaster is actually the citizen who they are supposed to actually protect and focus on the most. Now, the thing about protecting the regime is that there's an opportunity cost. It comes at the expense of something else, which means that you are not then protecting the citizen. Mm-hmm. So the reason why there's a low level of trust, on the citizen sides to the police, is this belief, and actually there's a lot of evidence that they are focusing on protecting the regime rather than the citizens. And two, that they actually underprotect the citizens, right? So even where the citizens are in need of police support, the police do not always show up on time, if at all, right? Which means that the citizens, it's not unusual that the citizens will distrust the police. But the police, on the other hand, look at the citizens as, all of us, they see us as potential criminals. The idea that whether you've done something wrong or not, at some point there is something that, you are likely to do. So that level of distrust is very difficult to bridge. Without, now to answer the question of how this can be fixed, without a proper orientation towards community policing, that actually prioritizes the protection of the people and the preservation of human rights, there is no way we can actually address this, because it's a scenario where something has to change on the side of the police for the citizenry to trust them more, and then to be able to work with them in more collaborative manners, to produce better security outcomes for the country.
Right. Something you said reminds me of something you wrote much earlier, and it's, I think, can be crystallized in a statement that sounds quite catchy, that there are parts of Kenya that are underprotected and overpoliced, or certain populations in Kenya that are underprotected and overpoliced.
Yeah.
Talk to us about that dynamic, and how do we then restore that or fix that?
So this happens a lot, not just in Kenya, it's around the world. One of the biggest problems of policing is that when they're dealing with marginalized groups, they tend to over-police them, which means that these groups are, targeted and victimized disproportionately by the police.
We saw this recently when we were having a spate of terrorist attacks, and one community was targeted to searches,
exactly,
questioning and so on.
Exactly. And if you've looked at the statistics, for instance, on extrajudicial killings in the country, the population that is overrepresented there is young men, but especially poor young men. So young men from the slums, will be very high in the count there. So the marginalized groups will tend to be over-policed. So they are, targeted and victimized at a disproportionate rate. Now, what then happens is, on the counter side, is that they are also not protected by the police. They're not offered police protection, even where they're being victimized, right? So for instance, young people, again, young men in the slums, it's very unusual for them to go to the police to report, even when they are victims of a crime, because one, they will not be thought of as innocent, they may not be believed for the claims that they are making, and actually they may then become suspected of being criminals and end up then being locked up, right? Now you can see this in, as we said, in the recent conversation about terrorism, you can see this also happening with protesters. If we think about protesters as one group of the society, it is also one that is over-policed and underprotected. So the police will use as much force, excessive force. But at the same time, they're not protecting the citizens or even bystanders. So this is how we end up with scenarios where we have babies or children being shot or being clobbered to death, like we've seen before, like baby Pendo, or even bystanders actually getting attacked by the police, as well. So that's the kind of counterbalance that, you're over-policed on the one hand and you're underprotected. And yet the job of the police is actually to protect the citizens.
But doesn't this then create a situation, and we've seen this in throughout our history and even currently, where now citizens take matters into their own hands? We're seeing a rise in vigilantism. Talk to us about how dangerous that is, and really, how do you then restore that trust in the institutions?
So, in fact, the question of vigilantism, we have to see two sides to it.
Okay.
One side, which is where the citizens take matters into their own hands and decide to provide security. We've seen this unfold before, either because the groups emerged organically or whether they were inspired by, sponsorship by, politicians. In the 90s, there was the Jeshi la Mzee. I wasn't old enough to see it, but I've read about it.
Jeshi la Mzee,
and then, of course, you come just then you see the Mungiki and all that. Exactly.
Yeah.
But, and that, if you remember...
Subiji and so
Baghdad, I know those kind of things, right?
Yes.
Pulling back from that is very difficult. And in fact, what we saw happening in the wake of, dealing with Mungiki was quite a lot of state brutality, which is a scenario we shouldn't really go to or even look forward to. And that's something that worried me a lot when I saw this week some politicians were arming some, young people to counter the protesters. But there's a less often talked about side of vigilantism, which is police vigilantism, right? Which is where certain police officers kind of take this very hard stance approach to law enforcement and justify their actions by saying, look, the courts are not working. So if we get these criminals and take them to the courts, we don't really get the justice outcomes we are hoping for. Of course, they don't tell you often that it's because the investigations may not have been done very well.
Right.
And so you end up with a scenario where the police officers, kind of become the judge, the jury, and the executioner, right?
I've seen the cases of Heziwa Kayole.
So quite a number of those, right?
Yeah.
And they also tend to become very popular because in a context now, going back to where we had come from, in a context where people are over-policed and underprotected, when they see a policeman who is, promising to deliver on the justice outcomes, security and justice outcomes, in a quick and rapid manner, then these people become, almost celebrity-like,
heroes.
Right? Heroes. And I think this is really tragic to think about as a way of governing a society or even policing a society. And so this calls for us to go back to the conversations we had largely in 2008, following the post-election violence, on what did we see as the future of policing? How should we really structure our policing? What should be the guiding principles? We put this in the Constitution. We've changed the architecture of the police. We've changed their service standing orders. And yet we are still getting a lot of moving back because, in business, I hear this phrase that people use, that culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Oh, wow.
Right? So we haven't fundamentally changed the culture, the policing culture. And without really starting to address that, all the legal and institutional changes we might make are not likely to deliver the kind of outcomes that we might be looking for.
All right. Now, there's a couple of questions here from a viewer, and they're drawing a comparison with the situation in the United States, where there were widespread cases of police officers meting out excessive force in the line of duty, and it led to some changes, some progressive things, such as body cams, for example, to increase accountability and so on. Yeah. Talk to us about what opportunities the current protests present to us to retool our police going forward. What opportunities are now available to us to be able to forge a better future ahead in terms of policing?
So I think it's been, we shouldn't be here because we've already been here before and got to the point where we are having a conversation with ourselves as a country and saying, look, this is not working, we need to fix it. But as I said, we really haven't made much progress. The challenge is that sometimes in a moment like this, it almost feels like we are doing something so fundamentally new that everything else needs to be new. But actually, a few years ago, following the anti-IBC protests, IPOA, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, did a very good investigation and analysis of the policing of those protests and came up with very, clear findings about what the policing of those protests were like and where the gaps were and what needs to be done. So in fact, if the government was keen on actually addressing this challenge, what they might need to do is simply just go and pick up this IPOA report, look at these recommendations they have made, and then start implementing them. One of those recommendations is, police officers should be identifiable. If the job of the police is to provide security and to provide protection, it serves everyone that the police are identifiable. Because if someone steals from you, or if someone attacks you during a public assembly or protest, then you would know who to go and raise your query with. Now, we are seeing a scenario where not only are, police officers unidentifiable, we see hooded people who sometimes we don't even know whether they're actually police officers or not. And, like the abduction case that we witnessed yesterday, which revealed quite a lot actually about how this policing is being conducted. That's something that's already covered in the IPOA report as a recommendation. Another thing that is covered there is during public assemblies, if we are really keen on providing protection, right, and safety for the protesters, the citizens, then the state has an obligation to provide medical support for the people who get injured during the protests, right? Now, the scenario we have seen is quite the reverse, or even the direct opposite of this, where not only, on the one hand, incredible efforts by doctors to provide this, voluntarily provide this kind of support to protesters. But then, scenarios where the police are throwing tear gas canisters, tear gas at, medical camps or, attacking medical camps. So if we don't need to reinvent the wheel, the recommendations are there because the problem is not new. The problem is one that we've had for a while. I think what we are looking for, or what we would hope for, is now a commitment by the government that, look, we have seen that this is what a protest looks like. We are not excusing riots or people who are going to loot businesses and so on and so forth. But when citizens want to gather on the streets to present their demands, then the state has an obligation to protect them and to provide them avenues for doing that.
All right. Now, this is your camera right behind me. Yeah. Could you give us a parting shot, a message from your heart, from your mind to the people of Kenya? What would you say, quick as you can? This is your camera, straight away.
Yeah, so I think it's been a phenomenal period to look at and see how our country is changing. And I'm looking forward to seeing the governance changes that are going to emerge as a result of this agitation by Gen Zs.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That has been Dr. Kamau Wairuri. Thank you so much. Appreciate you for coming and appreciate you for sharing your insights on Insight tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've learned something. I certainly have. One of the things that stands out for me is that this is not a new problem and the solutions have already been covered by those that came before us. So how about we dust off some of those wonderful reports and just get them implemented? Isn't that so? Sure. Wonderful. My name is Victor Muyakane. I wish you a good night full of God's blessings, and thank you to all the people that made this a reality. Good night and see you next time.